Hello everyone, tonight we slip quietly into rooms that no textbook dared to enter, curl beneath linen sheets or straw-stuffed mats and hover where incense curls through darkness, where the flicker of an oil lamp marks a moment no one ever talks about out loud: sex in ancient civilizations. Not the stuff of romance scrolls or sanitized history lessons, but the tangled truth, messy, often mystical, sometimes miserable, and never just between two people. A priest might be involved. An entire village might be watching. A contract might lie rolled up beneath the bed. And here's your little reality check. If you lived back then, chances are your first night wouldn't be candlelit. It might be public, or painful, or performed with a total stranger who'd been bartered for goats. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from, post your location and the local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts with the idea of the bed not as a private retreat, but as a political stage. In many ancient homes, a bed wasn't even in a room. It was a corner, a woven mat, or a wooden platform in full view of family or servants. Sex wasn't hidden behind doors. Sometimes there were no doors. A newlywed couple in a Mesopotamian village might find themselves celebrated with neighbours singing outside their hut, waiting for the sheets to stain red. And no, that wasn't romantic pressure, that was social proof. Virginity was currency, and in the cruel economy of patriarchy, that stained cloth could decide a woman's future. You lie on your side and wonder how many of those first nights were spent in silence, or trembling, or confusion. There were no schoolbooks or quiet conversations with understanding parents. The talk you might have gotten, if anything, was less biology and more obligation. For some it came with blessings and fragrant oils. For others with warnings and linen soaked in bitter herbs. And for most girls the first encounter wasn't a choice, it was a transaction. Dowries were paid, contracts signed, bodies handed over like territory. Historians still argue whether love ever truly played a part in ancient unions, or whether that's a modern fantasy stitched onto old cloth. Meanwhile, in places like Egypt and Greece, sex and divinity often danced uncomfortably close. It wasn't just private behaviour, it was ritual, celestial, a thing priests might choreograph. Picture a young woman selected to serve as a bride of the god, participating in sacred rites with a temple figure cloaked in incense and metaphor. You might think this sounds poetic, until you remember she was likely a teenager, and the man beside her, a stranger cloaked in ceremonial authority. This wasn't seduction, it was scripture-backed coercion. Yet the clay tablets record it as devotion, not domination. And then, of course, there were expectations. For men to perform, for women to bleed, submit, and bear fruit, preferably sons. If you were barren in ancient Assyria, the fault wasn't shared. You, not he, were the broken one. Remedies ranged from odd to horrifying. Animal organs, charms stitched into clothing. Ritual intercourse with another man at the goddess's temple. Even today, archaeologists find fertility idols clutched in the skeletons of women buried far too young. These weren't trinkets. They were desperate prayers pressed between ribs and hope. What's most jarring is how little privacy there was, not just physically, but culturally. In small tribal communities or early towns, everyone knew who was bedding whom. Marriages weren't celebrated for love, they were announced like mergers, a union of land, a pact of bloodlines. And when consummation happened, it was often confirmed by others, relatives, elders, midwives. Some societies even held witness ceremonies where proof of the act had to be offered immediately. The modern idea of a night to yourselves, unheard of. The curtain was metaphorical and rarely closed. Still, it wasn't all gloom and grim reality. There were moments fleeting maybe of affection, learning, and even laughter. Some ancient love letters reveal surprisingly tender sentiments, clumsy flirtations scratched onto pottery shards or folded into linen pouches. "You're like honey to my lips," one Babylonian husband wrote his wife. Even the gods grow jealous. He probably also compared her to a plump fig, but hey, that's how metaphors worked back then. Even if marriage was arranged, attraction could still blossom like weeds between paving stones, unplanned but stubborn. Yet for those outside the accepted mould, women without dowries, men of non-virile manner, or anyone whose preferences didn't align with tradition, intimacy was riskier, and sometimes punishable. Ancient law codes from Sumer to Jerusalem had harsh words and penalties for sex outside narrow definitions. Fines, public shaming, beatings, even stoning. Still people bent the rules. Humans always do. Love finds doorways, desire scales walls. And every civilization left behind hints of secret meetings in vineyards' rooftop rendezvous, or sand-scuffed paths between distant huts. In these flickers of human behaviour you realise something both reassuring and unsettling people have always wanted to be wanted. To be seen not as property or function, but as a whole self, a body and a mind, a soul with skin. That longing slips between the lines of every ancient text, between clay tablets on kingship and prayers for rain. You'll still find a plea for tenderness. And yet remember this as we drift further into this hidden history: not every act was mutual. Power weighed heavy. Sex was not neutral. In some palaces it was a weapon, in others a requirement, and in many homes it was just one more chore before sleep. The question isn't whether sex existed in ancient times, it obviously did. The question is who controlled it, who suffered it, and who, if anyone, enjoyed it. Now as your pillow warms beneath you and the fan hums softly nearby, we press onward. Past the papyrus screens and stone thresholds, into the perfumed heat of a temple city beside the Nile, where love smelled like myrrh and obligation, where pleasure and pain were both wrapped in linen. Slip into the sticky heat of ancient Egypt now, where the air hovers heavy with sandalwood and sweat, and even the gods were rumoured to blush. Beneath the moonlit hush of reeds along the Nile households weren't whispering about love, they were stockpiling onions, preparing fertility charms, and consulting scribes about what time of year was best to conceive a son. You might imagine a sultry paradise of gold-skinned bodies gliding across alabaster floors, but sex in ancient Egypt wasn't a private indulgence. It was national business, divine symbolism, and awkward hygiene advice bundled into one. A strong family meant a strong state, and that meant everyone from lowly grain tax scribes to royal daughters were expected to well get busy with purpose, and sometimes unfortunately with instructions. Let's start with the oils. Egyptians didn't just use them for embalming. Bottles of perfumed oil made from lotus moringa or blue water lily lined the shelves of wealthier homes like a pre-dynastic Sephora. They were believed to heighten desire, protect fertility, and possibly ward off crocodiles depending on who you asked. Women applied them before visiting lovers. Men wore them on their beards. Even statues of the fertility god Min were oiled and wrapped in ceremonial cloth. Historians still argue whether this was about reverent seduction or just good skincare. But to ancient eyes, scent was the beginning of desire, and maybe the only part that didn't involve paperwork. Speaking of paperwork, few civilizations documented sexual expectations as dutifully as Egypt. Papyrus scrolls laid out everything from recommended sex positions to what food a wife should eat if she wanted to bear sons. Spoiler onions, always onions. One fragment recommends men avoid fish before bed, too cooling for masculine virility apparently, and another suggests a woman drink a potion made from dates, honey and crocodile dung to prevent pregnancy. Yes, you heard that right. Dung. Crocodile. Inserted vaginally. It's one of those details that remind you ancient medicine was equal parts faith guesswork and pure biological bravado. And no modern science does not support the method. But don't laugh too quickly. There was intention in every oddity. To the ancient Egyptian, sex wasn't just a physical act, it was layered with divine resonance. Take Hathor, goddess of love, music and fertility, whose festivals were famously rowdy. Devotees drank beer until they couldn't stand straight, danced to drum beats deep into the night, and invoked her blessings through, you guessed it, ritual intimacy. The line between sacred and sensual blurred so thoroughly that some temples had attached houses of life where priestesses enacted divine unions on behalf of the gods. Were they revered spiritual guides or institutionalized courtesans? Historians still debate it. But the fact remains, sex was sometimes seen as a form of worship, a kind of dusty ecstasy, half prayer, half practice. And yet for all its elevation, sex was also tightly controlled by social roles. Wives were expected to be chaste and loyal. Husbands, not so much. A man could take concubines, visit musicians, a euphemism in some texts, or pursue pleasure companions in the market district provided he fulfilled his duties at home. Women, meanwhile, had fewer options and harsher consequences. Accusations of adultery could result in banishment beating, or worse, though the punishments varied wildly depending on class. A noble woman might suffer social exile, a servant girl, something closer to a warning carved into her back. Egypt may have painted its walls with soft curves and gentle kisses, but beneath the surface lay a clear double standard. Royal bedrooms came with their own peculiarities. Pharaohs were not just men, they were gods in flesh, which made their reproductive lives public concern. Royal incest was common, intended to keep bloodlines pure and preserve divine essence. A sister wife might share the throne. A half-sibling might become both queen and niece. The tombs are full of these entangled titles, and while we often imagine Cleopatra seducing Rome with her charisma and eyeliner, she herself was likely the product of generations of such closed-circle unions. The result: power concentrated, gene pools muddled, and enough family tension to fill an obelisk. One preserved tale tells of a prince who, on a quest for a bride, was advised by a wise man to seek a woman who is clever, silent, and fertile like the soil. Romance wasn't really part of the plan, neither was mutual attraction. Marriages were arranged ages mismatched, and no one asked the bride how she felt about it. Sometimes she was 12, other times not much older. But always the expectation was obedience and the ability to produce heirs before her first wrinkle. If not, a second wife might arrive, or a third. There were no laws against polygamy, only budgets and ambitions. That said, intimacy wasn't always absent. Carvings and paintings show couples embracing kissing, and even sharing small domestic moments like a husband handing his wife a lotus flower, or a mother nursing beside her partner. These glimpses suggest that affection did exist at least sometimes, and that love, though rare in marriage, could bloom afterward like papyrus in mud. One famous tomb inscription reads, "My beloved is with me, like the shade of a tree. I sat in her presence, and my heart was refreshed." Not exactly Shakespeare, but still more tender than many would expect from a society that used feces as family planning. Of course not everyone had partners. Single men might join the army or priesthood. Unmarried women might live with relatives, work as weavers or mourners for hire, or if daring, take on lovers in secret. Queer relationships are harder to document, but two male servants, Niank-Khnum and Khnum-Hotep, were buried together in a tomb that many argue shows romantic affection, holding hands, touching noses, even labelled as joined in life and death. Are they Egypt's first gay couple, or simply brotherly? Close scholars still argue whether this was intimacy or metaphor, but the artwork whispers its own quiet suggestion. And so you roll onto your side in the dark and consider this a world where sex was sacred and strategic, fragrant and fear-filled, as natural as the flood of the Nile and just as unpredictable, where oils ran slick onions, promised boys, and every act echoed through the halls of gods and ancestors. It wasn't modern, it wasn't fair, but it was human, strangely, achingly human. In the thick sun-cracked heat of ancient Mesopotamia, where clay tablets baked harder than bread and ziggurats reached like staircases to heaven, sex often came with a receipt. Cities like Zurich and Babylon weren't just trade hubs and cradles of law, they were also home to some of the oldest records of sex, marriage and divine union ever etched by human hands. Here, between irrigation canals and towering temple complexes, pleasure didn't always whisper from behind curtains, it could echo down stone corridors sanctioned by gods and tallied by scribes. And if you were a young woman pledged to Inanna or Ishtar, goddess of love and war, Your initiation didn't involve scripture or solitude. It involved strangers and silk, and rituals no one explains in high school history class. Historians still argue whether sacred prostitution was ever truly institutionalized, or if it's just a mistranslation that stuck like dried mud on sandals. But what's certain is this: in some Mesopotamian temples, women often called Nadatu Entu or Kadishtu were linked to the divine through sexual rites. Some were priestesses, some were unmarried elite women cloistered into temple service, and some, it seems, were participants in rituals where sex was believed to bless harvests, fertility, or civic harmony. These weren't casual affairs, they were prescribed, and perhaps for some profoundly spiritual. For others it was ceremonial obligation dressed in gold jewellery and ritual incense. A young man might enter a shrine on festival day dressed in his best wool, and dripping with anxious sweat, knowing his offering was more than a lamb or silver coin. He might be told to wait in a chamber offered wine sweetened with dates, and then ushered into the presence of a veiled woman, her eyes lined with kohl, her voice rehearsed. She might chant invocations to Inanna. She might remain silent. What happened next was considered a reenactment of the divine marriage between Inanna and Dumuzi, the shepherd god. But in practice it was two mortals doing what mortals do under the weight of myth and expectation. The Epic of Gilgamesh, that ancient echo of longing and wrath, offers glimpses into this ritualized sensuality. In one episode, the temple priestess Shamat is sent to tame the wild man Enkidu, not with blades but with her body. Over 6 days and 7 nights she civilizes him through intimacy, transforming him from beast to man. It's a scene both praised and debated. Was she a priestess, a courtesan, a symbol, or simply the earliest recorded example of weaponized seduction? Scholars still argue whether Shamat's role reflects real temple practice or just mythological metaphor. But either way, it reminds us in Mesopotamia, sex could be not just sacred but strategic, and strategy mattered. Marriage here was a contract literally. Carved into stone or pressed into clay, it listed assets, dowries and conditions: love optional, virginal proof, recommended, children expected. A woman who bore no sons might be cast aside, or her husband might take a second wife, or sleep with a slave, all legal, all enforceable. The wedding night wasn't candlelit, it was notarized, and just like with land or oxen, breach of terms had consequences. One tablet even records a man attempting to return his wife like defective pottery, citing poor temperament. She was not amused. Neither apparently was the court. Still, for those outside formal union there was room, albeit tight for pleasure and companionship. Courtesans and tavern girls operated near marketplaces or near city gates, often blurring the line between musician companion and sex worker. Some wore red veils, others jingled with bronze ankle bracelets. They weren't temple affiliated, but they offered respite to soldiers, scribes and merchants tired from bartering for barley. In some texts they're dismissed, in others romanticized. One poem tells of a man who dreams of a woman with breasts like pomegranates and a voice like spring rain. He doesn't ask her father for permission. He just listens as she laughs in the streetlight. Not everyone was free to choose, of course. Slaves male and female had no say in when or with whom. They could be gifted, traded or violated with impunity. And even among the free, virginity was valued differently depending on class. Elite daughters were shielded, peasant girls less so. Some were married at puberty, others were offered to temples, often permanently. One surviving law code from King Hammurabi lists penalties for violating temple women, a rare protective clause in a sea of patriarchy. Still, enforcement likely varied. As always, rules were written by those least affected by them, but amid the grim rules and rigid structures, threads of tenderness survive. In dusty clay envelopes now displayed under museum glass, love poems still whisper across 4,000 years. My beloved, my honey man, my precious one lover writes, come to me with the fragrance of cedar wood. Another promises to wait as the tamarisk waits for rain, her desire as vivid as her metaphors are weird. There's even evidence of husbands and wives using pet names and exchanging private jokes, like one carving where a man refers to his wife as my moonlight after dark market days. The heart, it seems, occasionally got a word in. And what of pleasure itself? Were Mesopotamians good at it? Did they enjoy it? We'll never know, not really. But some surviving tablets offer hints. Instructional fragments, half destroyed by time and conquest, describe positions, rhythms, and even bedroom architecture. Beds were raised platforms, often with carved headboards. Some rooms had peepholes, others decorated ceilings. One especially eyebrow-raising recipe mixes wine with henbane and mandrake, likely an early aphrodisiac. Or an early hospital visit. Historians still argue whether such concoctions were functional or fatal. But someone somewhere was definitely trying to spice things up. Now as the shadows stretch across your room, think of those ancient nights beside the Euphrates. Think of temple lanterns glowing soft behind linen curtains, of chants echoing off stone of lovers and strangers and worshippers, all folding into each other beneath divine eyes carved in alabaster. Sex in Mesopotamia wasn't private, it wasn't personal, but it was real. And whether in temples or tenements beneath goddesses or just under heavy blankets, it left behind more than myths. It left memory etched in clay. The sun hangs lazily over the marble colonnades of Athens, where olive trees rustle in the dry breeze, and the laughter of boys echoes off white stone. You walk past a gymnasium, not the sweaty treadmill kind, but an open-air training ground where philosophy, politics and wrestling collided under one naked sky. Here bodies were everything. Oiled, sculpted, admired, and not just for sport. The Greeks saw physical beauty as a reflection of inner virtue, though virtue was a word that flexed and bent depending on who was watching. In this world, male-male relationships weren't just accepted, they were praised, idealised, even philosophised into something nobler than ordinary desire. Older men, often citizens with beards and reputations, took younger boys under their wing. They were called Erastes lovers, while the boys were Eromenos beloved. There were rules, of course, rules about age class roles and dignity. It was not just sex, it was mentorship, supposedly. Though today modern scholars look at these guiding bonds with eyebrows permanently arched. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were romantic, exploitative, or somewhere in the unnerving in between. The gymnasium was where these relationships often bloomed, part locker room, part philosophy salon, part social theatre. Picture older men reclining nearby while boys wrestled naked, oiled from head to toe. Muscles slick under the Mediterranean sun. Trainers watched. Poets scribbled. Everyone noticed. And while some encounters remained platonic, others blurred into physical intimacy. Some even crossed into public scandal. One philosopher, Diogenes, once mocked the custom by offering himself naked to a boy declaring no need for flattery, take what you want. That sort of honesty was rare even then. Meanwhile, for women the experience couldn't have been more different or more restricted. Athenian wives married young lived indoors and were expected to keep their thoughts quiet and their bedsheets clean. Their husbands might have courtesans known as heterae who were educated, witty and far more free than the wives back home. These heterae could dine with men, debate even own property, but they were still outsiders. And although they were admired, they weren't respected in the way male philosophers were. Sex with a wife was for children. Sex with a courtesan was for pleasure. Sex with a boy, that was for the gods. It's hard to pin down Greek sexuality in tidy boxes. They didn't categorise by orientation like we do. Desire was about dynamics dominant and passive, older and younger citizen, and not. The act mattered less than who did what to whom. Penetration was power. Being penetrated was submission. And in a rigid society obsessed with hierarchy, even in bed, someone had to be on top socially and otherwise. This framework left little room for two equals to just well enjoy each other. That concept didn't quite fit in marble. There are artifacts, vases, mosaics, graffiti, that depict these relationships sometimes with surprising tenderness. A bearded man offers a hair to a boy, a traditional courting gift. Another shows a man reaching gently toward a youth, their names inscribed beside them like a soft declaration in paint. One vase shows two men embracing while a flute player watches discreetly. It's not always lewd, sometimes it's domestic. But always it speaks to a society where intimacy was part performance, part possession, and part pedagogy. At symposiums, those legendary dinner parties where wine flowed like philosophy things got looser. Reclining on couches, men drank diluted wine, recited poetry, and flirted with boys who served them drinks. These were spaces of wit excess and barely veiled eroticism. Music played, jokes flew, and sometimes behind woven curtains or in quiet corners things happened that the official scrolls politely omitted. Even Socrates, the father of rational thought, wasn't immune. He was rumoured to have had more than a few affectionate thoughts about handsome young students, though whether he acted on them is another grey area historians like to circle, but never land on. Still, for all their marble glory and philosophical posturing, the Greeks were painfully human in their contradictions. They celebrated love between men, yet scorned effeminacy. They elevated desire in myth, Zeus transforming into a swan Apollo, chasing boys across the sky, yet punished improper conduct in public. Citizens could indulge, but only if their role stayed respectable. Foreigners, slaves, and women were excluded from the dignity of desire. It wasn't about who you loved, it was about whether your love made you look weak, and weakness in Greek terms was often equated with being on the receiving end. Even in same-sex relationships, the one being taken bore the social risk. Boys were protected only until they matured. After that, continuing the role of beloved was frowned upon. You were expected to grow into dominance, into manhood, into control. Those who didn't, who remained soft-spoken, passive-adorned, were subject to ridicule, whispers, and worse. One comic playwright mocked such a man by giving him the voice of a woman and the posture of a swan. Not very subtle. But then neither were the Greeks. For the record, not every Greek city-state shared Athens' blueprint. In Sparta, where boys were raised in barracks and trained for war, emotional bonds between male soldiers were encouraged but kept away from domestic affairs. In Thebes, elite military units were sometimes composed of bonded lovers, under the belief that men would fight harder to protect someone they loved. And in the island of Lesbos, female poetry hinted at affections rarely spoken elsewhere. The poet Sappho, from whom the word lesbian eventually evolved, wrote lines of aching softness to her female companions. "Sweet mother, I cannot weave, slender Aphrodite has crushed me with longing." That line alone has launched 1,000 interpretations, each scholar gently disagreeing over how much was metaphor and how much was memory. So you lie back now, imagining marble floors warm from sun voices drifting across a courtyard, the soft scrape of lyre strings behind columns. You think of a boy still figuring out what attention means. You think of an older man uncertain whether he is mentoring or manipulating. You think of a wife alone in a darkened room while laughter rises from a symposium she'll never attend. Greek love was complicated, polished on the outside, cracked beneath. And like so much in this ancient world, it tells us more about power than it does about affection. In ancient Rome, love wore a toga, but marriage wore a ledger. Behind the columns and coinage, beneath the marble statues of stern-faced ancestors, Roman unions weren't so much about affection as they were about alliance. A marriage was a transaction, a handshake between households, a way to transfer land titles and sometimes deeply repressed emotional baggage. The bride, often barely into her teens, was moved like property from one paterfamilias to another, her dowry bundled like grain, her opinions rarely consulted. And if you were the groom, your biggest concern wasn't compatibility. It was whether her family had good political timing. The wedding ceremony itself could be extravagant or simple, but its meaning was always heavy. The bride wore a flame-coloured veil symbolising her transfer into a new household, one where she now addressed her husband as Dominus or Lord. Guests tossed nuts, not rice. The couple was led through rituals invoking Juno, goddess of marriage, and occasionally muttered prayers for fertility, even as the bride likely trembled behind her veil. When she crossed the threshold, she was lifted because to trip was a bad omen. But for many Roman women, the real stumble came afterward in a life of duty without much say in the direction it marched. Roman marriage didn't require love, but it did require heirs. A citizen man was expected to produce legitimate children's sons preferably, and his wife's primary job was to enable that. Her sexuality was monitored, her womb practically state property, but her husband's fidelity, that was optional. A Roman man could take mistresses, keep lovers, visit brothels, or pursue household slaves with impunity, as long as he avoided scandal. The double standard wasn't just accepted, it was legal doctrine. A wife caught cheating might be divorced, exiled, or even killed by her father. A husband caught cheating might receive a shrug, and a reminder to be more discreet next time. Still, the side arrangements came in categories. Courtesans called meretrices were visible, and professional often licensed and taxed. They worked near the baths in taverns or from private rooms, above shops often marked by a single red lamp in the window. Their services were transactional, but their reputations varied wildly. Some were mocked in graffiti, others wrote poetry or held salons that attracted scholars. Then there were concubini, unofficial companions who lived with a man but weren't legally married to him. They could form long-term bonds and sometimes bore children, though their status remained ambiguous. Lastly, there were the slaves, those with no legal autonomy, no right of refusal, no place in the histories unless their names were scrawled in someone else's margins. Despite all this, Roman women weren't always passive figures. Some managed to carve out influence through family wealth or sheer willpower. A matron might subtly steer household politics, orchestrate marriages, or advise her husband behind the scenes. Some women even found ways to initiate divorce. Yes, Roman women could legally divorce their husbands, though the social cost varied. And a few wealthy, educated, unbothered by gossip, took lovers of their own, discreetly or not. The poet Ovid wrote gleefully of such women praising their wit and daring, even as he warned them not to trust poets, which frankly is good advice in any century. Love, if it came, was often a later development or a side dish. Romantic affection between spouses was seen as sweet, but unnecessary, even suspicious. A senator too enamoured with his wife might be mocked for weakness. A woman who laughed too freely with her husband might be accused of immodesty. Emotion was best reserved for tragedies on stage or victories in the forum. Marriage was duty, not drama, and yet buried in letters and epitaphs, you can still find whispers of something warmer. In one tomb inscription, a man writes of his wife, "She was my heart's companion, not only in joy, but also in judgment." Another simply says she never scolded, and of course there were exceptions, scandals, affairs, courtroom dramas. Emperor Augustus famously reformed Roman morality, imposing laws that punished adultery and rewarded childbearing, all while his own daughter Julia lived a romantic life so lively she was eventually exiled for it. Gossip columns didn't exist, but public inscriptions and satirical poems filled the gap. Martial, a famously snarky poet, wrote barbed couplets about women with multiple lovers, men obsessed with perfume, and senators whose wives were seen exiting the gladiator barracks a little too often. It was the ancient version of tabloid culture, etched in stone and recited in forums. The physical spaces of Roman intimacy were just as layered. Wealthy homes had separate bedrooms for husband and wife, not necessarily for privacy, but because intimacy was often scheduled or symbolic. Beds were small, wooden, creaky. Curtains could be drawn, but more for dust than discretion. In poorer households, entire families might sleep in the same room or even the same bed. Privacy was rare, and intimacy, when it happened, often had an audience of creaking floorboards and murmuring neighbours. Still, couples found moments, a glance by candlelight, a hand brushed during morning bread. Even in a world of duty, desire still found corners. And what about same-sex relationships? They existed, though, shaped by the same Roman obsession with roles. A freeborn Roman male could have male lovers as long as he was the penetrator, and his partner was lower status, usually a slave or non-citizen. The opposite submitting was ridiculed. Effeminate men were satirized on stage, painted in mosaics with exaggerated hips and limp wrists. Yet even with mockery, these relationships existed, documented in graffiti love spells and poetry. One exasperated note etched on a tavern wall reads, "Lucius, stop dreaming of Marcus. He will never look at you. Unrequited love, it seems, predates Latin. Now you exhale into the dark, your thoughts drifting through marble halls and vine-covered atriums, where marriages were inked like treaties, and love affairs blossomed behind vine-draped lattice. Where wives counted heirs and looked the other way, where mistresses held more power than statues, and where the eternal city's beating heart thumped with ambition, betrayal, obligation, and sometimes late at night something that felt almost like love. Slip now into the silk-draped hush of ancient China, where moonlight pools quietly on lacquered floors, and incense curls like thoughts from the lips of sleeping courtiers. Here sex wasn't just a private act, it was a philosophical exchange, a medical matter, a ritual of balance between yin and yang. Emperors consulted manuals before touching their concubines. Scholars debated the proper direction for harmonious climax. And while other civilizations focused on domination or reproduction, China asked a very different question. How can desire be used to nourish life? At the heart of this view was the concept of key life energy and its movement between bodies. Sexual union, especially for men, was seen not as release, but as retention. A man's semen contained essence jing, and losing too much of it was believed to weaken the body, shorten life, or fog the mind. So manuals advised moderation technique and sometimes rather ambitious restraint. In contrast, women's sexual fluids were considered nourishing. So oddly enough, a well-trained man was expected to help his partner reach pleasure repeatedly, without necessarily finishing himself. Historians still argue whether these practices were widely followed or simply idealized in elite circles, but the texts remain surprisingly detailed and occasionally optimistic. These manuals, such as the Classic of the Bedchamber and the Plain Girl's Secret Instructions, were part medical treatise, part poetic guidebook, and part social instruction. Some read like gentle choreography, move like clouds, pause like cranes, breathe like pine trees. Others are blunter listing positions with charming names like tiger pounces on prey or frog gazes at the moon. There were diagrams, too elegant ink sketches that resembled brush painting more than anything scandalous. The tone was often clinical, calm, even spiritual. Sex, after all, wasn't dirty. It was sacred science, but only when done properly and preferably on auspicious days with adequate rest and maybe a ginseng tonic or two. In the imperial court, things got more complicated. Emperors were expected to bed many concubines, not for fun, but for politics and posterity. The emperor's virility was tied to his heavenly mandate. To ensure fairness, a strict schedule was maintained by court eunuchs, who tracked the rotation of concubines like stargazers watching constellations. Records from the Han dynasty describe how each night a selected concubine's name would be written on a slip placed in a golden box and drawn by officials. She would then be ceremonially bathed, perfumed, and carried naked in a silk blanket to the emperor's chambers. Romantic. Not exactly. Efficient. Painfully. And once there, the emperor was expected to control himself. Retaining his seed was seen as wise governance. Spending too much of it, especially with lower-ranking women, was considered reckless, even dangerous. Some emperors took this to heart. Others, less so. The infamous Emperor Wu of the Liang dynasty reportedly died mid-act, ignoring advice to abstain. Meanwhile, Emperor Xuanzong of Tang, known for his obsession with the beautiful Yang Guifei, was blamed for spending too many nights with her while neglecting state affairs. The fall of dynasties, it seems, was sometimes traced back to the bedroom. For common people, sexuality wasn't so scripted, though, still touched by the same principles. Folk remedies for arousal or fertility abounded: dried tiger bone, powdered deer antler, or oddly cicada husks. One might hang a charm above the bed, carve aphrodisiacs into chopsticks, or drink elixirs that glowed faintly in the dark. Love potions were a cottage industry. So were love poems. Rural wedding nights were often filled with nervous silence and the smell of camphor and rice wine. and if someone didn't know what to do, a friendly elder might hand over a scroll and say, "Read this before sunset." Women's sexuality was a paradox, celebrated in literature, feared in law. In Taoist texts, women were praised for their mysterious depths, their multiple orgasms, their power to draw down the moon through love. In Confucian family codes, however, a woman's pleasure was irrelevant. Her role was to obey bare sons and maintain harmony. Widows were expected to remain chaste for life. Some even committed ritual suicide after their husbands died, a practice later honoured with loyalty arches. Still, not every woman bowed to the rules. In poetry we hear from bold voices like Li Qingzhao, who wrote of longing and lips and sleepless nights her ink smudged with heartbreak. One suspects she read a manual or two and tossed it aside when the wind changed. Then there were the courtesans, educated, elegant, and essential to the cultural nightlife of dynastic capitals. They were not prostitutes in the crude sense, but companions trained in music, poetry, and subtle wit. A well-off merchant might spend an evening drinking plum wine while a courtesan played guqin and quoted zhuangzi. Intimacy might follow or not. Either way, the experience was crafted like calligraphy, fluid, deliberate, refined. Some courtesans published poetry, others gained fame equal to generals, and though their status was precarious, their influence was real. They lived outside the Confucian mould and in doing so reshaped it ever so slightly. The Chinese also had early versions of sex toys, yes, even thousands of years ago. Archaeologists have unearthed polished stone phalluses from the Han Dynasty, likely used either for stimulation or ritual. Some were buried with women, suggesting either affection or hope for posthumous satisfaction. There were also jade eggs used not for display but for internal training. Yes, those existed long before Instagram wellness influencers got hold of them. Were these items taboo? Not exactly. Just discreet. Like everything else in a culture that preferred veiled allusions over blunt declarations. So now as your head rests soft against your pillow and the scent of imagined sandalwood lingers in the back of your mind, picture a chamber where jade tiles glimmer and silken screens rustle in the night breeze, where intimacy is slow, studied, and seasonal, where desire isn't a spark, it's a river, and its course is traced by careful hands, ancient texts, and the hush of breath beneath embroidered covers. Breathe in the scent of cardamom and sandalwood as we arrive in ancient India, where temples rise like mountains from jungle mist, and carved stone figures dance along their edges in eternal union. This is the land of the Kama Sutra, a name that sparks winks and knowing glances in the modern world, but whose original purpose was less scandalous and far more philosophical than most would guess. The Kama Sutra isn't a sex manual in the way people imagine. It's a guide to living well. To love, yes, but also to manners, conversation, grooming, and how to sit gracefully on a swing. It's a lifestyle document, not ancient porn. And yet within its carefully inked pages, sex still finds its place methodical, mindful, and more complicated than a quick scroll through history tends to suggest. Unlike the fleeting passion of casual dalliance, Indian texts treated sex as a sacred art. Not a shameful necessity or mere physical release, but one of the four pillars of life Kama, alongside Dharma, duty, artha, prosperity, and moksha liberation. A balanced life required a healthy appreciation for pleasure, and pleasure wasn't just carnal, it was aesthetic, sensory, spiritual. The Kama Sutra itself, compiled by Vatsyayana in the 3rd century CE, was meant for the urban elite. It instructed on everything from how to decorate a room for intimacy to the social standing of courtesans, and while it does include instructions for acrobatic positions with names like Congress of the Crow, it's really more focused on timing respect and knowing when to stop. The images people associate with the text limbs entwined like ivy, improbable backbends, mid-air somersaults aren't even in the original manuscript. They were added centuries later during British colonial rule by illustrators, more interested in selling titillation than transmitting tradition. The original work is a surprisingly dry structured read, more advice column than erotic novel. A man should avoid lying about his wealth, one passage reads. Another warns, too much time spent with women leads to weakness. Some things never change, but embedded in the instructions are deep insights about gender power and the way relationships ripple through every corner of society. In India's ancient city-states and empires, sexuality was rarely private. It echoed from temple walls, literally. The sculptures at Khajuraho and Konark, famously adorned with explicit scenes of passion, were never meant to arouse. They were designed to honour the divine union of Shiva and Shakti, cosmic masculine and feminine forces. These carvings weren't hidden. They greeted visitors at temple entrances, a reminder that sacred energy includes every facet of human experience, not just the polite ones. Historians still argue whether these temples reflected actual social norms or aspirational symbolism, but the stone doesn't blush. It simply exists, ancient and unapologetic. Sex education, if we dare call it that, was woven through many layers of Indian thought. Ayurveda, the ancient science of life, offered detailed advice on nutrition, stamina, and even the best seasons for conception. Hint late spring was considered optimal. It recommended herbs like ashwagandha and shatavari to balance sexual energies, and advised against intercourse on full moons or after large meals. Celibacy was respected in some traditions, particularly among monks and renunciants, but householders were encouraged to engage in sex mindfully as an expression of affection and dharma. Balance again was the mantra. No guilt, but also no indulgence without reflection. For women, things were layered. In theory, a woman's desires were to be honoured texts, acknowledged female orgasm, pleasure and even sexual initiative. The Kama Sutra describes women as having different personalities and preferences, each requiring different approaches to courtship and intimacy. It even provides guidance for women who wish to seduce a lover, from perfume selection to conversation starters. But theory and practice often parted ways. Patriarchal customs tightened their grip as centuries passed, and while a courtesan in a bustling city might enjoy a level of freedom and education unheard of elsewhere, most women had their choices bounded by family caste and societal expectation. Courtesans or ganikas held a unique place in ancient Indian society. Far from mere entertainers, they were often skilled in music, dance, poetry and politics. Some trained for years under older women, mastering not just physical arts, but the emotional intelligence needed to navigate a world of kings and merchants. A courtesan might influence state affairs, befriend philosophers or outwit rivals at court. They were respected and envied. They lived outside the normal family structure, which gave them a strange kind of freedom but also left them vulnerable. Still, when a respected courtesan passed away, her funeral was often lavish, her memory preserved in verse. As for the average couple, intimacy wasn't just about bodies, it was about rituals. Before a wedding, auspicious timings were calculated down to the hour. Astrologers advised on compatibility not based on charm or hobbies, but on planetary alignment and ancestral charts. Wedding nights were choreographed, an oil bath, the exchange of garlands, perhaps a few stilted conversations while elders lingered outside the door pretending not to listen. For many brides, this was their first private moment with their husband. Nerves, perfume, the creak of a wooden bed. One hopes someone at least remembered to close the shutters, and yet in the poems and songs that survived, intimacy often glows with warmth. The Gita Govinda, a 12th century lyrical masterpiece, tells of Krishna and Radha's romantic longing, their stolen glances, their reunions under moonlit trees. It's sacred, yes, but also incredibly sensual. Her garment slips, one verse reads, and he trembling follows its fall. No manuals, just breath, skin, spirit. These stories don't separate love and devotion, they melt them together like ghee and flame. So now as you nestle deeper beneath your blanket, picture a room lit by oil lamps where a silk canopy shivers in the breeze and jasmine petals float in a copper bowl beside the bed. A couple sits quietly, knees just touching, sharing tea before the moment unfolds. No rush, no performance, just two people guided by memory manuals, or maybe just the soft ache of curiosity exploring the dance that has pulsed beneath India's surface for centuries, quiet as a temple bell at dusk. Now draw the heavy curtain aside and step into a home of ancient Judea, where oil lamps flicker against stone walls and the hum of evening prayer mixes with the aroma of baking bread. Here sexuality lived mostly in silence, tucked neatly behind law ritual and modest linen. In the Hebrew world, sex was not forbidden, it was sacred, but only when precisely contained like fire in a lamp. Step outside the prescribed boundaries and that same fire could burn reputations, families, entire communities. Pleasure was permitted, even encouraged within marriage, but it was hemmed in on all sides by law, custom, and unspoken consequence. Sex in the Hebrew Bible was never just about bodies, it was about lineage, law, and covenant. To know someone in the biblical sense wasn't merely euphemism, it was a moral and legal pivot point. Virginity mattered deeply. So did inheritance rights. A man who seduced a virgin could be forced to marry her or pay her father the bride price, depending on whether the act was deemed consensual. The line between protection and control was often thin, blurry, and decided by elders at the city gate. And if you were a woman, your worth in society might hinge on what happened one night behind one closed door. Marriage, according to Torah law, was both a contract and a divine command. Be fruitful and multiply wasn't just poetic, it was a requirement. The ketubah, or marriage document, spelled out obligations, food, clothing, and conjugal rights. Yes, conjugal rights, meaning a husband was legally bound to provide sexual intimacy, not just shelter. For some rabbis, this was a joyful commandment. For others, a duty of compassion. But for the wife, her pleasure wasn't always part of the legal conversation. Historians still argue whether love played a role in these arrangements, or if passion was simply a tolerated visitor that showed up unannounced. Still within the privacy of the home, affection could flourish. The Song of Songs, a poetic book tucked into the Hebrew scriptures, overflows with sensual imagery. Your lips drop sweetness like the honeycomb. Your breasts are like two fawns. It's not a marriage manual. It's a love poem, erotic, vivid, and unapologetically mutual. It has sparked centuries of debate. Is it an allegory between God and Israel, or just a beautifully honest portrayal of human longing? The answer, as always, lies somewhere between metaphor and memory. But the poem stands as rare biblical permission to celebrate passion desire as song, not sin. Yet for all the lyrical indulgence of the song, daily life operated under stricter codes. The purity laws in Leviticus dictated when sex could happen and when it couldn't. A woman's menstrual cycle rendered her unclean for 7 days, during which all sexual contact was forbidden. Afterward, a ritual bath mikveh restored purity. This wasn't about shame exactly, it was about ritual space. Cleanliness meant readiness, not morality. Still, it set boundaries around the female body that were interpreted and enforced mostly by men. Some saw it as protective, others as a form of distancing. Either way, it meant a woman's cycle shaped the rhythm of intimacy in every household. Adultery, on the other hand, was treated with far less nuance. A man who slept with another man's wife committed a grievous sin punishable by death for both parties. The woman's marital status, not the man's, determined the crime. A married man sleeping with an unmarried woman, socially frowned upon but legally murky. A married woman sleeping with anyone but her husband, catastrophic. Even the suspicion of infidelity could trigger the Sota ritual, a humiliating ordeal, where a woman drank bitter water in the temple, while priests watched for signs of guilt. It was part trial, part spectacle, part cautionary tale. Whether justice was truly served remains forever uncertain. Of course, not every act of desire was criminal, but some had no name, no category, just unspoken rules and quiet risks. Homosexuality, for instance, was condemned in Leviticus in stark terms, but the reality on the ground was likely more complex. As in most ancient societies, what happened in shadowed alleys or under woolen blankets wasn't always publicly recorded, and yet hints linger. David's love for Jonathan in the books of Samuel is famously intense, more wonderful than the love of women he declares. Was it political brotherhood, poetic metaphor, or something deeper veiled in sacred ambiguity? Historians still argue whether David and Jonathan's bond was spiritual or romantic, or whether the line between the two ever really mattered. Meanwhile, in everyday homes, sexuality was shaped not just by scripture but by social need. Large families were economic security. Sons meant status. Daughters meant careful negotiation. For barren women like Sarah, Rachel and Hannah in the scriptures, infertility was not just grief, it was public shame. Solutions range from prayer to surrogacy. Hagar, Bilhah and Zilpah all bore children for their mistresses, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. It wasn't romantic, it was logistical. Love again was not the driving force, survival was. Yet even within such a tightly regulated system, human nature found cracks. Forbidden glances across market stalls, secret letters exchanged through laundry lines, a moment by the well that lingered too long. Ancient Jewish texts are full of warnings, not because no one ever crossed the line, but because so many came close, and some leapt. The fact that so many laws had to be written tells you something else. People have always wanted what they weren't allowed to have. Now let your thoughts settle into that small candlelit house nestled between clay rooftops and fig trees. Picture a married couple years into routine sharing a laugh over lentil stew. Picture a bride on her wedding night heart pounding beneath a borrowed veil. Picture a forbidden lover pressing a note into a crack in the stone. For all the laws, all the rules, all the lines drawn in ink and stone passion, still flickered behind closed doors, unrecorded but very much alive. Slide now into the scented hush of ancient Persia, where the air tastes faintly of rosewater and smoke from sandalwood braziers, lingers beneath domed ceilings. This is not a world of open displays, but of veils, screens and whispers, where sex lived behind thick embroidered curtains and never raised its voice in public. Persian culture, especially under the Achaemenid and later Sasanian dynasties, prized discretion in all things, and intimacy was no exception. Unlike the bold carvings of India or the performative rituals of Mesopotamia, Persia wrapped its desires in metaphor and fragrance. To speak of love was to speak in poetry, and to make love was to do so in carefully cultivated silence. Marriage, like much else in Persian life, was arranged with an eye on lineage, alliance and property. The family unit was the basic cell of empire, and within it the wife was expected to be obedient, fertile and ideally modest. Polygamy was practiced especially among nobility, and royal harems grew vast and ornate, not just with women, but with layers of etiquette, hierarchy and politics. These weren't pleasure palaces in the Hollywood sense, but administrative structures where favoured women could wield influence and forgotten ones faded behind lattice. A king's night with a concubine might be scheduled weeks in advance, recorded by eunuchs in quiet ink. The more sons she bore, the more power she held. But love that wasn't on the registry. Still love lived, just not always where you'd expect it. Persian poetry from the classical period, especially under the later Islamic Golden Age, is dense with longing. Though written centuries after the Achaemenid kings, the echoes trace back through tradition. Take the works of Hafez and Rumi, filled with metaphors of wine gardens, lips and loss. While they're often framed as mystical or allegorical, there's an undercurrent of human yearning that runs unmistakably physical. I want your smell to wake the roses, one verse pleads. Historians still argue whether these were devotional metaphors for God or tender tributes to actual lovers. Perhaps they were both. In Persia, after all, love and longing were often deliberately inseparable. Physical intimacy, particularly in elite circles, was framed through ritual and refinement. Scent played a central role, perfumed oils, incense, even petals strewn across the sheets. Baths were elaborate layered experiences, scrubbing, soaking, massaging, steaming. A woman preparing to meet her husband or king might spend hours grooming, oiling her hair, dusting her skin with powdered saffron or ambergris. Men too took pride in presentation. Beard oil, fresh robes and musk behind the ears weren't vanity, they were virtue. The body was a temple, and intimacy, when it occurred, was meant to feel worthy of poetry carved in marble. Persian manuals on sex and marriage existed, though many have been lost or absorbed into later Islamic works. The surviving texts emphasise pleasure, but always wrapped in order. There were ideal times of the month for union foods to enhance vitality, pomegranates, honey, pistachios, and etiquette about approach. Loudness was discouraged. So was haste. One passage warns, "To rush is to dishonour her soul." Another advises men to smell her hair before touching her, for scent reveals her mood. There's an elegance to it all, structured, ceremonial, yet quietly personal. The rules may have been rigid, but within them care could grow. In the royal court, sex was as much about control as connection. The king's harem was both refuge and political mechanism. Women were often gifts, daughters of nobles, captured royals, or hand-picked beauties raised within the palace. Eunuchs guarded the gates, kept the schedules, and sometimes mediated disputes among the women. Rumours of intrigue, sabotage, and competition were common, though many accounts are coloured by outsider fascination. To Western travellers, the harem was a forbidden Eden. To insiders, it was a gilded prison with a strict dress code and no exit signs. And yet some harem women rose to remarkable prominence. If a woman captured the king's heart, or more accurately bore him a son, her chambers expanded, her servants multiplied, and her voice could reach all the way to the throne room. Royal mothers often became advisors, quietly pulling strings while hidden behind veils. This wasn't sexual liberation, but it was a pathway to power paved with silks and sharpened glances. One might not choose her fate, but once inside she could shape it with grace or cunning. For ordinary Persians, intimacy unfolded in quieter, humbler spaces. Mud brick homes with inner courtyards provided seclusion, and within those walls couples shared their lives with a level of privacy uncommon in many ancient cultures. Marriage ceremonies were family-centred, often including blessings from elders, symbolic hand-fasting, and shared meals. The wedding night, not public, not pressured, just two people behind a door left to figure out centuries of expectation, with maybe a few quiet words and the scent of rose oil clinging to their wrists. No crowd, no feast waiting for confirmation, just time. Same-sex desire existed too, though rarely spoken aloud. As in many ancient cultures, masculinity was guarded fiercely, and being the passive partner in a male-male relationship could be ridiculed. Still, poems survive verses that hint at older boys admired by younger ones, masters writing longingly about male servants or travellers sighing over a beautiful cupbearer. Persian art occasionally depicts such scenes, though usually couched in the safety of allegory. It's not absence, it's erasure. The desire was there, it just wasn't supposed to have a name. Perhaps what stands out most about ancient Persian intimacy is the sense of restraint. Not repression necessarily, but containment. Everything had its place, its hour, its fragrance. Even love. Especially love. It was not shouted or flaunted. It was written in calligraphy, folded into silk and whispered when no one else could hear. Persian passion was less fire and more ember, slow, quiet, enduring. Hidden beneath the surface but deeply felt. So as your room darkens and the fan hums its soft rhythm, imagine a chamber washed in lamplight and perfume, a breeze stirring the silk canopy above a low bed. Imagine two hands meeting slowly, cautiously, as if learning one another's language in the pause between breaths. There is no audience, no chant, no rule being broken. Just privacy, precious and rare, a rare night in a world where love was poetry, and silence was often the truest kind of intimacy. Now step into the chill of the northern world where longhouses creak in the wind hearth. Smoke clings to woolen cloaks and the air smells faintly of salted meat and pine. This is Viking territory, land of sagas and swords, where love stories were told between raids and sex lived in the space between blood feuds and brooch pins. The Vikings weren't just battle-hardened berserkers, they were farmers, poets, traders, and surprisingly sentimental letter-writers. And though their world was rough-hewn and harsh, their ideas about intimacy were anything but simple. Beneath the iron and ice there was tenderness, even, dare we say, cuddling. Marriage among Norse people wasn't about fairy tales. It was about alliances, land, and keeping your cows from ending up on your brother-in-law's side of the river. That said, Viking women had more legal rights than many of their contemporaries. They could inherit property, initiate divorce, and own land. A woman's consent was technically required for marriage, though her family's voice often roared louder than her own. Still, compared to many other ancient cultures, Norse women weren't just vessels for heirs, they were household leaders, spiritual guides, and sometimes witches. And any man who crossed the line with them might find himself cursed, or worse, stabbed. Wedding nights were public knowledge, if not quite public performance. A couple was led to bed with ceremony, often by friends or family members wielding torches or cracking off coloured jokes. The act itself wasn't watched, but it was confirmed. Evidence wasn't always required, but gossip was inevitable. If no heir came within the expected time frame, the couple might be mocked in verse, or blamed for offending the gods. Still, intimacy was considered an important part of the marital bond, not just a baby-making requirement. And while Norsemen weren't writing Kama Sutras, they clearly appreciated the pleasures of the bed as much as the glories of the battlefield. In sagas and folklore, sex is often a hinge for revenge or honour. A man sleeps with another's wife, prepare for 20 years of poetic bloodshed. A woman tricks a chieftain into bed. She might rise in power or be accused of sorcery. One tale tells of a shield maiden who refused all suitors until a clever farmer seduced her with a riddle about onions and swords. Another speaks of a bride stolen on horseback the night before her wedding, carried off in a snowstorm by a man she secretly loved. Historians still argue whether these stories reflected real customs or just saga dramatics. But even in myth, desire was a force to be reckoned with. The Vikings weren't particularly shy about bodies. Bathing was regular weekly, at least more than could be said for many medieval Europeans. Combs, tweezers and soaps have been found in graves along with fragrant herbs and grooming tools. Cleanliness was not just vanity, it was part of attraction. A sagely Norse saying advises no one is ugly after a bath. Men and women both braided their hair, wore jewellery and took pride in appearance. Seduction began with grooming, and maybe with a cup of mead and a poem whispered beside the fire. Sex outside marriage wasn't unheard of, though it came with risks. If a man seduced an unmarried woman of equal status, it was often overlooked. But if she became pregnant, or if her family didn't approve, things could escalate quickly. Fines, feuds, or worse. Adultery was taken more seriously. A wife caught cheating could be divorced, disfigured, or forced to walk barefoot through snow. A husband caught cheating. Less scandal, more shrugs. Still, some sagas flip the script. In Laxdela saga, a woman rejects her arranged marriage and runs off with her lover. They're pursued, of course, but not condemned. The saga seems more interested in loyalty than legality. Interestingly, Viking culture had space, however narrow, for queer relationships. Male insults often centred around accusations of being aegir, unmanly, effeminate, passive in sex. This was a serious charge, one that could result in a duel. But the insult wasn't about love between men, it was about social roles. As with many ancient cultures, it wasn't the act, but the position that drew scorn. Evidence for female same-sex relationships is thinner, but some rune stones and poems suggest intense bonds between women that blurred lines. Were they romantic, platonic? The Norse didn't spell it out, but affection, loyalty, and chosen companionship carried weight regardless. One charming glimpse into Viking romance comes from burial sites. In several graves, couples were buried side by side, sometimes holding hands or facing one another. Jewellery pieces inscribed with endearments, paired drinking horns, even shared pets. These weren't warlords and princesses, just ordinary people who in death wanted to remain close. One grave in Denmark contained a woman buried with her keys, the symbol of household authority, and her husband beside her sword laid respectfully at her feet. It says something. Maybe not about fiery passion, but about mutual respect. As for foreplay, the sagas don't give us manuals. But Norse poetry is full of flirtation, innuendo, and double meanings. Apples, milk, shields. Everything meant something else. A man might sing to his beloved of how her eyes were sharper than a raven's wing. A woman might offer a woven belt and say, "It will fit if your heart is true." If that sounds like a line from a fantasy novel, well, it kind of was. Vikings weren't just raiders, they were storytellers. And the stories they told often began in the dark, with laughter under fur blankets. Now as your breath slows and your room grows still, picture a longhouse in winter. The fire flickering low, snow tapping lightly at the wooden walls. A couple lies close beneath woven wool, their legs entwine the smell of pine and leather in the air. No ceremony, no poetry, just warmth in the cold fingers grazing fingers. The world outside may be ruled by oaths and axes, but here beneath the carved beams and sleeping dogs, intimacy curls up like a cat purring softly in the dark. Let the sliding doors shut behind you now as we enter the hushed refinement of classical Japan, where sex-like poetry was rarely spoken directly and never shouted. This was a world of layered silks, moonlit tatami mats, and eyes lowered in long, careful glances. Intimacy here was quiet, seasonal and full of ritual pauses. If desire in Viking lands was a drinking song by the hearth in Heian-era Japan, it was a flute note trailing through fog. And nowhere did that note play clearer than in the art of the pillow book. The Heian period, roughly spanning the 8th to 12th centuries, was a golden age of courtly culture. Aristocrats measured their lives in calligraphy strokes and incense blends, and relationships were conducted through elaborate systems of coded fan gestures, midnight visits and flowing robes. A man didn't barge into a woman's chambers, he slipped in through the garden gate after composing a suitable poem. And if the poem pleased her, she might let him stay. If not, he might find the door bolted and a withered plum blossom left in his sleeve. Consent in its own refined way was part of the game. In this world, sex was expected, normal, but never coarse. It was woven into aesthetics, folded into ritual. A nobleman might visit multiple women in a week, exchanging poems each morning and tiptoeing out before the rooster crowed. A woman, meanwhile, might entertain more than one suitor, over time without scandal, provided she followed the decorum of discretion. Morning after poems were a key part of this dance. If a man failed to send one, his absence would sting louder than any insult. You left before the dew had dried, one poem reads. Was the night not warm enough to delay you? The Makura no Soshi, or the Pillow Book, written by court lady Seishonagon, offers a rare first-person view into this era. It's not erotic per se, but full of quiet sensuality, detailed lists of things that make the heart beat faster, including glimpses of handsome men half seen behind curtains. The Genji Monogatari, or Tale of Genji, meanwhile, is perhaps the world's first psychological romance novel, tracking the amorous escapades of Prince Genji with emotional nuance and a healthy dash of scandal. He seduces noblewomen commoners, even one or two, who probably should have been off limits. Yet the language remains delicate, never crass. It's what's not said that stirs. Sexuality was less moralized than managed. Buddhist monks preached restraint, of course, and Shinto purity rituals influenced bathing and body customs. But there wasn't a rigid binary of sacred versus sinful. Physical desire was part of life, sometimes disruptive, but rarely demonized. The imperial court made room for it. And while some scholars debate how much the literature reflects everyday life, the consistency across sources suggests a society that acknowledged pleasure, particularly for the upper classes, as part of the human experience, not a failing to be punished. Class mattered greatly. Commoners likely had more practical, straightforward relationships, marriages arranged within villages, consummated without poems or perfumes. But even in those spaces, traces of Heian decorum lingered. Wedding nights were private. Women often wore their hair long and loose, seen as a sign of natural beauty. In some regions, a bride's family might prepare a quiet feast outside the couple's home, hoping the smell of good rice and stewed fish would bring blessings and muffle awkward sounds. For samurai families in later periods, intimacy grew more regulated. Marriages served political alliances, and love was not a prerequisite. A samurai husband might be distant emotionally or physically, for long stretches on campaign, or simply avoiding awkwardness. Wives were expected to be dignified, loyal, and tireless in domestic matters. Still, stories survive of samurai wives writing their own poetry, or keeping lovers in secret while the world believed them stone-faced and celibate. Desire, after all, doesn't vanish beneath armour. In Edo period Japan, erotic art flourished openly, shockingly, and with an eye for both humour and high craftsmanship. The shunga woodblock prints made by respected artists like Hokusai and Utamaro depicted everything from tender couplings to absurdly exaggerated anatomy. These weren't hidden under floorboards. They were sold at markets, exchanged as wedding gifts, and even used in sex education. A bride might receive a scroll illustrating what to expect in her new household, sometimes with cartoonish octopuses, sometimes with gentle lovers exchanging whispers. Historians still argue whether shunga reflected real practice or fantasy, but its popularity suggests a culture that at least sometimes laughed about sex, rather than hiding it. Same-sex love had its own place, particularly among monks and samurai. Nanshoku the male way was a term used to describe relationships between older men and younger acolytes or companions. These weren't always sexual, but often were and carried their own codes of honour and secrecy. Samurai diaries describe deep bonds formed during campaigns, sometimes blossoming into love affairs. The line between friendship, mentorship and romance blurred. As with so many things in Japanese culture, form mattered as much as feeling. Still, for women outside the elite, life was less poetic. Courtesans in the pleasure districts of cities like Kyoto or Edo were highly trained, revered in some circles, and romanticised in kabuki theatre. But behind the artistry lay hardships, strict contracts, demanding patrons, and little personal freedom. Some rose to fame and earned their way out. Others didn't. Yet even there, intimacy wasn't always transactional. A courtesan might fall for a regular visitor. A client might abandon wealth for a fleeting connection. Reality didn't always follow the script, but people clung to the beauty of the story anyway. And now, as your eyes grow heavier, and the hush of the room deepens, picture a paper screen gently rattling in the wind, a flickering lantern casting shadows across smooth wooden beams. Two figures sit in silence, knees nearly touching, words few but understood. Maybe there is a poem folded under one sleeve. Maybe not. Perhaps love doesn't need a name tonight. Only stillness. Only breath. Only the comfort of shared quiet in a world that moves too quickly, even with the dawn so far away. Now step barefoot onto warm, sun-cracked earth, where drums pulse like a second heartbeat, and the night air carries the scent of wood smoke, rain-soaked soil, and blooming baobab flowers. We are in pre-colonial Africa, not one place, but many kingdoms and communities scattered across a vast, complex continent. From the savannas of Mali to the forests of the Congo Basin, from Nubian deserts to the river deltas of Yoruba land, the rhythms of life were tied to land ancestry and fertility. And sex, unlike in many other ancient cultures, was not always hidden or hushed. It was celebrated, observed, and folded into music, dance, and community rituals. In many traditions, fertility wasn't just a private hope, it was a shared ceremony. Across the African continent, attitudes towards sex were deeply rooted in communal identity. It was not merely biological or recreational, it was cosmological. Among the Ashanti of present-day Ghana, for instance, fertility rituals were performed at specific times of the year to honour the Earth Mother and ancestral spirits. Couples hoping to conceive might seek blessings from a local priest or priestess, offer food, or participate in ceremonial dances, where gestures mimicked the stages of union subtly, symbolically, and with surprising grace. In the Zulu tradition, certain coming-of-age dances for young women involved rhythmic stomping and shoulder movements that hinted without vulgarity at the body's power to create life. Historians still argue whether these performances were meant to educate, attract suitors, or simply affirm the beauty of becoming. Many African societies maintained a balance between modesty and openness. Nudity, for instance, wasn't automatically sexual. In warmer regions, bare skin was normal, practical and symbolic of innocence or maturity depending on age and context. Sexuality was acknowledged without shame, especially in tribal ceremonies or rites of passage. In some Bantu communities, young people were taught about sex by elder mentors through song storytelling and hands-on guidance. Yes, even demonstrations with wooden models and symbolic metaphors involving maize and cooking pots. These lessons weren't considered scandalous. They were sacred education necessary for the well-being of the entire village. Marriage customs varied widely. In the kingdom of Kush, near the Nile, noble families often married within clans to maintain bloodlines, sometimes between siblings, echoing the practices of neighbouring Egypt. Among the Yoruba, the concept of multiple wives polygyny was common, especially for wealthy men or those with spiritual status. Each wife held a designated role. First, wife mother of sons, keeper of crops and rivalry, was both expected and managed. Love might bloom or it might not. But affection could be seen in small acts, a husband repairing his wife's cooking pot, a wife placing palm oil in her husband's sandals before a journey. These gestures meant as much as whispered promises in other worlds. For women, sexuality was both a gift and a responsibility. In matrilineal societies like the Akan lineage passed through the mother, and a woman's sexual agency was recognised with more autonomy than in many patriarchal cultures. However, this autonomy didn't always guarantee freedom from pressure. Virginity was prized in some areas, especially when linked to bride price negotiations, while in others, a young woman's experience was valued proof that she was fertile and knew how to please a husband. Courting was often playful. Boys might sing under a girl's window, girls might leave carved tokens outside a boy's hut signalling readiness or rejection. And once married, intimacy wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Fertility was wealth. Spirituality shaped everything. Among the Dogon of Mali, twin births were considered sacred evidence of cosmic balance, and sexual rituals were sometimes used to restore harmony after droughts, deaths, or tribal conflict. In Ifá, divination questions about a couple's intimacy might lead to offerings cleansing or prayers for realignment of energies. The idea wasn't that sex was sinful, it was that it had power. Misused, it caused disharmony. Honoured, it brought blessings. Even ancestors were thought to influence fertility, whispering advice or warnings through dreams and omens. Sexual taboos, of course, existed. Incest, adultery, and certain age-inappropriate unions were discouraged or punished. A man who violated a young girl might be exiled, fined, or ritually shamed, depending on the severity and the community's laws. But unlike some ancient legal codes that focus solely on women's purity, many African traditions held men equally accountable. In the Igbo tradition, a man who seduced another man's wife might be forced to confess publicly and pay reparations not because she was property, but because the household had been dishonoured. The consequence wasn't moral panic, it was the disruption of social harmony. That more than anything was the unforgivable sin. Queer relationships did exist, though rarely named as such. Among the Dagaba people, there were stories of sister wives who shared more than cooking duties. In the Swahili coastal regions, records from Arab travellers mention male partnerships that were known and in some areas quietly accepted. It wasn't always about identity, it was about connection. Gender roles were flexible in some spiritual traditions, especially among healers and spirit mediums. A person might be possessed by a spirit of the opposite gender during trance, adopting new behaviours, voices, even clothing. Was it theatrical, divine? Both historians still debate, but the echoes of non-binary expression ripple across oral histories and ceremonial dances alike. Erotic art existed too, though much of it was carved into utility objects rather than displayed. Wooden fertility dolls, often held by women hoping to conceive, were shaped with exaggerated hips and calm expressions. Clay figurines depicted couples in embrace not lewdly, but with quiet intimacy. Some tribes carved sexual imagery into initiation huts, or on ceremonial drums, teaching young people not to fear their desires, but to understand them. These objects weren't hidden. They were part of a life placed among millet jars and rain charms, waiting for the next generation to ask their questions. Now as night deepens and the imagined rhythm of distant drums fades into quiet, think of a small circular hut with thatched roof, the fire reduced to embers, the smell of shea butter on warm skin. A man and woman lie close to their legs, brushing beneath a woven mat. No scrolls, no inked instructions. just the soft lull of crickets, and the knowledge passed down in songs, dances, and the quiet pulse of blood. In this world, sex was not forbidden fruit, it was a seed, planted in trust, tended with care, and honoured as life itself. Step now into the dense, steaming jungles of ancient Mesoamerica, where temple pyramids rise through the mist like mountains carved by time and everything. The rain, the corn, the stars is part of a cosmic equation. The Maya didn't treat sex as separate from the divine. It was bound tightly into their worldview, entangled with creation myths' calendar cycles and the sacred dance of death and rebirth. Pleasure was never just personal, it was agricultural, astronomical and spiritual. To make love was, in a sense, to replant the cosmos. The Mayan creation story preserved in the Popol Vuh speaks of gods crafting humans from maize, the crop that sustained life. Corn wasn't just food, it was origin. And so the act of planting a seed, whether in soil or in womb, became an echo of divine intention. Fertility rituals reflected this belief. Men were encouraged to be potent not only in field work but in fatherhood. Women were honoured for their roles as bearers of maize, and midwives carried not just birth knowledge but spiritual power too. Birth and sex weren't clinical, they were ceremonial. In elite Maya society, sexuality also signified status. Rulers believed to be semi-divine were expected to marry, well-produce heirs, and demonstrate their fertility in public rituals, bloodletting ceremonies. Yes, literal blood offerings were sometimes performed by both male and female nobles to honour fertility deities and reinforce the ruler's link to the gods. A queen might pierce her tongue with a thorn and pass a cord through it, allowing her blood to drip onto sacred paper. That paper would then be burned, the smoke rising, as a divine offering. This wasn't abstract, it was visceral. Pain blood seed, they were all part of the same sacred currency. Marriage customs among the Maya were structured and pragmatic. Parents or community elders arranged unions, often through intermediaries. Astrologers calculated compatibility based on the couple's birth dates within the complex Tzolk'in calendar. Love wasn't irrelevant, but it wasn't the main ingredient. A marriage was about stability, legacy, and community cohesion. Ceremonies were simple but sacred, a shared meal, a prayer to household gods, and the couple's first night together, usually in a home built just for them. Privacy was granted, expectations were clear. Young people learned about sex gradually, sometimes from relatives, sometimes from experience. There were no formal manuals, but myths, pottery, and murals suggest a fairly open dialogue. Certain codices, like the Dresden Codex, contain veiled references to erotic symbolism, though much of it has been lost or intentionally destroyed. Still, what remains hints at a society that accepted sex as part of life's flow. A woman's menstrual cycle, for instance, was tracked with astrological precision. It was not seen as dirty but powerful, linked to lunar movement and divine timing. One wrong phase and a child might be born under an unlucky star. Fertility rituals were communal events. Entire villages might participate in ceremonies during planting or harvest seasons, calling upon gods like Ixchel, goddess of midwifery and love, or Shak the rain god. Offerings included food, flowers, feathers, and sometimes symbolic acts between priest and priestess. These were not wild orgies, but structured performances rich with metaphor. Water pouring into carved basins, corn husks peeled slowly, deliberately. The world itself was a body groaning, growing, and waiting to be renewed. Sex outside marriage was not without consequence. Inscriptions describe fines or punishments for adultery, though the severity often depended on status. A noblewoman caught with a commoner might be disgraced. A commoner caught with a noblewoman, possibly dead. Still love affairs happened. One preserved story tells of a king's daughter who ran off with a stonemason. The king, rather than killing him, demanded the young man build a temple high enough to reach the stars. When he did, the couple was wed at the summit. Myth, perhaps, but telling. Same-sex relationships in Maya society are less documented, though not entirely absent. Some vase paintings show figures of the same gender in close embrace, their roles ambiguous. Scholars debate whether these were servants, ritual participants, or lovers, and while the language of modern identity doesn't neatly apply, there's evidence that gender roles in Maya ritual life could be fluid. Shamans, for instance, often shifted between masculine and feminine personas, while in trance, channeling both sun and moon energies. Desire, it seems, was understood as a spectrum, not a script. Erotic imagery survives on pottery, mostly hidden away in museum backrooms, or fragmentary pieces buried under colonial censorship. These scenes, sometimes humorous, often tender portray couples mid-embrace hands tracing spines, eyes half-lidded. One bowl shows a woman laughing while her lover balances a cacao pod between his teeth, a sweet, literal nod to the aphrodisiac reputation of chocolate. Cacao wasn't just for dessert, it was sacred, offered to gods, consumed during courtship, even used in love potions. You didn't bring someone a bouquet, you brought a bitter, frothy cup of cacao spiced with chili and hope. And so, as you lay your head down tonight and the jungle sounds fade into a hush of imagined crickets and owl wings, picture a moonlit clearing of fire burning low in a ceremonial hearth, the scent of roasted maize mixing with copal resin. A man and woman sit close, their fingers sticky with melted chocolate, their laughter quiet under the stars. Around them the world listens, the gods, the trees the ancestors in their carved stone towers. For the Maya sex was never just an act. It was offering cycle creation. It was the planting of sacred seed. Drift now across the salt-kissed waves of the Pacific and step onto the warm, wind-swept shores of the Polynesian islands, where coconut trees lean lazily over turquoise lagoons and hibiscus petals drift through the humid air. It's easy to imagine this world as a sensual paradise, a postcard of soft sand, bare skin and open desire. But slow down. What seems idyllic at first glance is tangled in centuries of misunderstanding, colonial projection, and half-translated customs. Polynesia, like all places, held its own complex truths about sex, some liberating, some restrictive, and many rewritten by outsiders with wandering eyes and hungry pens. Early European explorers arrived with their own scripts, and when the islanders didn't match them, they rewrote the story anyway. Reports from 18th century visitors like Captain Cook and his chroniclers painted images of generous maidens willing gifts of flesh and communal freedoms that shocked the buttoned-up British. These stories sold. They were copied into journals, whispered in salons, and eventually embedded into literature and film. But historians now argue whether these were observations or fantasies dressed in exotic ink. Were Polynesians truly uninhibited, or were they simply performing hospitality within their own cultural codes, misread by men who saw what they wanted? What we know from within the cultures themselves is far more nuanced. In many Polynesian societies, such as those of Tahiti, Samoa, and Hawaii, sexuality was integrated into life without the Western binaries of sacred versus profane. There were rituals, roles, and etiquette. Virginity, for example, was valued differently depending on rank. High-ranking girls might be expected to remain untouched until marriage, while others faced fewer restrictions. But even purity wasn't always about moral virtue. It was about lineage, political alliances, and maintaining family mana or spiritual power. The body was not dirty. It was a vessel of status. Marriage customs were flexible. Some societies practiced trial unions where couples could live together before formalizing the relationship. If it didn't work, they parted without shame. Polygamy existed, especially among chiefs, and sexual relationships outside marriage weren't universally condemned. Instead, social order was maintained through respect for boundaries, chiefly authority, and communal consensus. A young person's sexual exploration might be guided, not punished by elders, and instruction could come from older relatives or specialists in love lore. Far from taboo, intimacy was part of growing up. In Hawaiian culture, the concept of aikane refers to same-sex relationships, particularly between young chiefs and companions. These relationships were often affectionate, emotional, and at times erotic, though again the definitions don't align neatly with modern Western labels. Ikan bonds were not stigmatized. They were accepted as part of the spectrum of chiefly life. Likewise, in Samoa, the Fa'afafini individuals assigned male at birth who embody feminine gender roles held respected places in society. Their presence wasn't scandalous. It was seen as a natural variation, with many contributing to both domestic life and cultural ceremonies. Gender here was fluid before gender fluid had name. Erotic expression existed in many forms. Chants, dances and tattoos all carried layered meanings. The hula, for instance, wasn't just entertainment. It was storytelling through body movement, and some hulas conveyed romantic or sensual themes. Tattoos or tatau could mark rites of passage fertility, or even intimate milestones. One Tahitian legend tells of lovers who tattooed their thighs with matching designs so their bond would be remembered in death. These were not crude gestures, they were art, pain and permanence combined. Sex was not spoken about loudly, but neither was it hidden in shame, and yet not all was idyllic. Power still shaped experience. Chiefs had more freedom than commoners. Women, especially in the presence of missionaries, found their roles quickly redefined under foreign rules. As Christianity spread across Polynesia in the 19th century, so too did Victorian morality. Tight collars, closed legs, and a flood of shame where once there had been silence or celebration. Suddenly, dances were indecent chants, pagan, and the open laughter of courtship was replaced with stern sermons. Colonial laws criminalised certain sexual behaviours, and traditional gender roles were flattened under imported hierarchies. Many Polynesian societies adapted, but something was lost. Whispered stories became secrets. Tattoo needles dulled. A girl who once might have danced in the moonlight was now taught to sit still covered in muslin. Even today, echoes of that imposed shame linger in conversations about sex across island communities. And yet the older knowledge survives in proverbs and songs, in the way elders sometimes smile when asked about the old ways. The body, after all, remembers. Historians today are working with elders, oral historians and hidden archives to rediscover what colonial narratives buried. And what emerges is neither utopia nor corruption, but human experience lived in balance with nature, ancestry and ocean winds. Sex was not always sacred nor always casual, it was contextual. A first kiss under a banana tree. A night spent listening to waves through the woven walls of a fail. A tattoo etched in pain and pride. These were the textures of love. So as you settle deeper into your blanket, with the hum of your fan replacing the sound of surf, imagine a distant island at dusk. Palm fronds rustle overhead. A fire burns low. Two people sit beneath a breadfruit tree sharing roasted fish and quiet glances. Their language has no exact word for sin, but many for love. Love in the form of laughter. Love in the gift of a flower. Love in the touch of a hand when no one else is watching. In Polynesia, sex was never only about desire. It was about belonging to a person, to a lineage, to the land. And no matter how many ships came ashore with pens and priests, that quiet truth has always remained. Now descend into the cold stone stillness of a medieval monastery where candlelight flickers against damp walls, and the only sound is the distant echo of a hymn barely audible beneath the weight of centuries. Here, sex is not merely avoided, it is denied, feared, written against in ink that smells faintly of guilt and drying iron. Monks are meant to be dead to the world, including their own desires. The body is a vessel for temptation, and to master it is a daily war. And yet behind cloistered walls and beneath woolen robes, desire did not die. It merely went silent, hiding between the lines of prayer and penitence. Monastic life was structured with military precision. Hours of the day were divided into fixed prayers, matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, vespers at twilight. Silence was sacred. Meals were taken without speech, gestures substituting for words, and in theory thoughts of the flesh were cast out along with worldly concerns. But the reality was messier. Temptation didn't knock on the monastery door, it lived inside it. Even the most disciplined minds were still attached to mortal bodies, and those bodies had their own opinions. Confession manuals from the period offer a startling window into what monks struggled with. These weren't vague, high-minded warnings, they were detailed, specific, and frankly a little alarming. Pages upon pages outlining sins of thought, of touch, of dreams. One 13th century guide for confessors listed over 40 variations of sexual sin, including sins committed alone in bed, sins committed while praying, and sins of excessive gazing. Some monks even confessed to acts committed in their sleep, unsure whether the dream or the desire was the true offence. Historians still argue whether these manuals reflected actual behaviour or exaggerated caution, but the volume says enough denial did not equal absence. The medieval church viewed sexuality through a lens of suspicion and hierarchy. Marital sex was tolerated, but only for procreation. Pleasure for its own sake was considered at best indulgent, at worst damnable. For monks who had taken vows of chastity, even a wandering thought could spiral into days of penance. Flagellation, fasting, and solitude were often prescribed. A monk who had impure dreams might sleep on the floor for a month. Another might wear an iron chain beneath his habit, as a reminder that the flesh was not to be trusted. And yet, within this strict framework, contradictions bloomed. Monasteries were often wealthy, well-fed, and at times disturbingly disconnected from the poverty they preached. In some cases, abbots kept concubines quietly supported by monastery funds. There are records of monks fathering children with local women, and arranging for them to be raised in nearby villages discreetly, of course. Some orders cracked down with reforms, others simply looked the other way. Human failure, after all, could be forgiven, if it was confessed properly and didn't make too much noise. The monasteries also became quiet sanctuaries for those who didn't fit easily into the expected mould of marriage and family. Young men unsure of their desires or pressured by inheritance laws might choose a monastic life not out of spiritual fervour, but as refuge. Inside they found routine community and a certain ambiguous space where deep emotional bonds could flourish. Some of these bonds were spiritual, some were more. Letters and poems exchanged between monks suggest more than brotherly love. "I long for your voice in the stillness," one monk wrote to another. "Your silence wounds me more than any penance." Art and marginalia add another strange layer to the picture. Illuminated manuscripts, often copied by monks, contain bizarre doodles in their margins. Rabbits jousting with snails, priests chasing geesemen with oddly placed faces. Among them sometimes appear explicit or semi-erotic scenes, naked figures, suggestive gestures, even lovers in mid-embrace. Were these jokes, protests, daydreams gone rogue under a quill? No one knows. But the fact that they appear at all suggests that even the most sacred scriptoria were not entirely immune to mortal preoccupations. Female monastic life had its own shadows and silences. Nuns, too, took vows of chastity, and were confined to convents, but their autonomy was often more limited, their walls even higher. Stories of liaisons with priests or secret pregnancies hidden behind cassocks occasionally leak through records, usually with scandalized commentary attached. One infamous case involved a convent where several nuns bore children over a single decade. The abbess claimed it was a miracle. The bishop was less convinced. Yet again, rules didn't always hold against reality. It wasn't just heterosexual desire that found its way past the gates. There are rare but striking references to same-sex intimacy in convents, often cloaked in theological language. Passionate friendships, spiritual marriages, shared visions. A few texts even describe dreams or encounters involving the Virgin Mary or Christ in overtly sensual terms. Scholars debate whether these were metaphor madness or something more honest than anyone dared admit out loud. But even in the safest spaces, the boundaries between spirit and body often blurred in the dark. Despite the rules, the punishments, and the ceaseless vigilance, desire didn't disappear in monastic life. It adapted. It disguised itself as devotion. It tucked itself into prayers and habits and long longing stares across stone cloisters. One monk wrote in his journal, "I fast, I scourge, I kneel, and still at night the warmth finds me." Whether he meant dreams, memories, or something else, the implication is clear: the body has a stubborn memory. It does not always listen to vows. Now as your room quiets and the candle flickers its final glow, Imagine a cloister wrapped in night, the air cool with stone and incense. A young monk lies on a wooden cot, his hands folded, his eyes open. Outside an owl calls once then again. Inside a thought stirs that no prayer can quite banish. And in that flicker between devotion and denial, something very old and very human rises, then settles like a sigh through the chapel rafters. Step now into a world wrapped in incense and paranoia, where stained glass casts rainbows across cold stone, and the line between holiness and heresy trembles like a candle in a draught. In medieval Europe, women's sexuality lived under the double gaze of saints and inquisitors. To be chaste was to be closer to heaven. To be desiring or desired was to invite suspicion, seduction, or sorcery. It didn't matter whether the passion was real. What mattered was who saw it, who feared it, and who wrote it down. Saints, especially female ones, were often praised for their resistance to carnal temptation. Martyrs like St. Agnes and St. Cecilia were said to have turned down marriage and sexual advances in favour of eternal devotion, choosing death over defilement. Their virginity was not just spiritual, it became a political symbol wielded by the Church to define ideal femininity. But many of these saints were teenagers, some were children. Their stories were told by male scribes, edited by bishops, and canonised into ideals few real women could match. Holiness came with a price, and often that price was the denial of the body. And yet those same hagiography saints' biographies are full of strangely sensual details. Visions of Christ caressing the saint's hair, or placing rings on her finger like a lover. Ecstatic union with God described in language more fitting to a bridal chamber than a chapel. St. Teresa of Avila famously wrote of an angel who plunged a fiery dart into her chest, leaving her utterly consumed in the love of God. She was speaking of spiritual rapture, but the imagery, as even church historians admit, is almost startlingly erotic. Was it metaphor or something the saint herself couldn't untangle? Outside the convent walls, women who expressed sexuality differently, too freely, too boldly, too mysteriously, were branded something else entirely, witches. The line between healer and heretic was razor thin. A midwife who used herbs to ease childbirth, helpful until the baby died. A widow who lived alone with her cat and brewed teas for menstrual cramps, wise until someone got sick. And if a man dreamt of her afterward flushed with shame and desire, well, then clearly she had cast a spell. Witch trials didn't begin as full-blown persecutions. They simmered slowly, fueled by anxiety, crop failure, and the need to explain away lust and illness. But by the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the hammer came down hard. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum laid out lurid theories that witches had sex with demons, that they stole men's virility in the night, that they kept imps to pleasure them during Sabbaths in the woods. These weren't random accusations, they were projections. Men terrified of their own desires pointed fingers at women who made them feel too much. Confessions extracted under torture produced elaborate stories. Women spoke of being lifted into the sky, of dancing naked with horned figures of obscene kisses, placed on goat bellies and secret pacts made in candlelit groves. But read closely and you'll see something strange. These crimes often mirrored repressed fantasies, accusers describing in vivid detail acts they supposedly feared. The accused in agony and desperation repeated what their inquisitors wanted to hear. A woman's dream became evidence, her pain proof, her body once again not her own. But not every woman feared her sensuality. Some reclaimed it even within religious bounds. Visionary mystics like Hildegard of Bingen wrote music and poetry that merged flesh and spirit. Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century English mystic, described sensual weeping sessions with Christ, including one vision where she sat on his knee and kissed his cheek. Her detractors called her mad. Her defenders called her blessed. Either way, she refused to be silent. Desire didn't leave her when she found God. It changed shape, but it didn't disappear. Folk traditions also carried traces of older understandings. In the Slavic forests, the rusalka, a water spirit, was both feared and revered. She lured men into rivers with her beauty, but was also associated with fertility and the cycle of life. In Celtic lands, the bean knee washed blood-stained clothes by the river a harbinger of death, but also a reminder of the womb and womanhood's ties to fate. These figures weren't saints, but they weren't witches either. They stood in the foggy in-between where sex and soul touch fingertips. Even among the church's most devout followers, dreams could become battlegrounds. Nightmares of temptation were blamed on demons, but some dreams were different. Soft, glowing, impossible to forget. A monk might wake gasping after dreaming of a woman's voice calling his name. A nun might feel a warmth in her chest she couldn't quite pray away. Some wrote about these moments, most did not. Yet their silence is its own kind of record. And what of the everyday women? The bakers' wives, the shepherd girls, the laundresses who lived without visions or accusations. They too had dreams. They too felt heat between their thighs, and wondered whether the Virgin Mary had ever wanted something she couldn't confess. Perhaps they spoke to one another while gathering water. Perhaps they touched themselves in darkness and whispered a prayer for forgiveness or didn't. Their stories weren't written, but they existed, curled into the night like secrets beneath coarse wool blankets. Now, as the candles in your room burn lower and the weight of centuries settles into silence, picture a stone chamber with a single narrow window, a figure kneeling before a crucifix, her breath shallow, her heart racing. Outside, a storm swells. Inside, she feels something she cannot name. Is it sin? Is it grace? Or simply the body remembering itself? In a world that carved women into saints or witches, sometimes the truest desire was to be neither just human, just warm, just real. Step into the candlelit corridors of palaces where silk whispers through marble halls, and the air itself seems to pause waiting. Here, sex was not only a matter of private desire, it was strategy currency, and often the throne itself. In the ancient world, power flowed through lineage, and lineage flowed through the bedchamber. For women with ambition and intelligence in times that rarely gave them thrones, pleasure became something more than personal, it became political. And few wielded it better than Cleopatra Wuzetian, and their lesser-known but equally cunning sisters across time. Let's begin with Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, mistress of language and architect of some of the most enduring sexual myths in history. Much has been written about her beauty, but even her enemies admitted it wasn't her face, it was her mind. Fluent in multiple languages, trained in politics and science, she knew that charm was a weapon, and timing was everything. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not simply passions, they were alliances. Rome was hungry. Egypt was cornered. She didn't flirt to be admired, she flirted to survive. Cleopatra's seductions were theatrical and calculated. One story tells of her arriving to meet Caesar wrapped in a carpet, unrolled at his feet like a living gift. Another has her sailing up the Cydnus River to Antony, in a golden barge dressed as Aphrodite with rose petals raining down and musicians playing on the breeze. Whether these events happened exactly as described, or were embroidered by Roman propaganda, is unclear. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra was a manipulative temptress, or simply a savvy ruler using the tools available in a man's world. But either way she made power blush, and when Rome finally turned against her, it wasn't her beauty they feared, it was her ability to make powerful men change course. On the other side of the world, Wuzetian was crafting a legend of her own one, with fewer rose petals and more steel. Born in 7th century China, she entered the imperial court as a concubine, and rose slowly through a maze of whispered alliances, accusations and political marriages. She became empress consort, then regent, then unthinkably emperor in her own name. Not empress. Emperor! The only woman in Chinese history to hold that title outright. Her critics accused her of using sex to manipulate the throne, but Wu's power ran deeper than the sheets. She understood the dynamics of the imperial harem where women were not only companions but chess pieces. It wasn't just about sleeping with the right man, it was about timing pregnancies, forging bonds with eunuchs, and eliminating rivals quietly. She had lovers, yes, some half her age. But by then she didn't need their influence. She had her own. Her use of sexuality wasn't submission, it was sovereignty. And while court historians painted her as cruel and lustful, their fear speaks louder than their words. Throughout history, powerful women have often been branded as dangerously sexual, regardless of whether they actually were. It was easier for chroniclers, mostly male, to reduce female influence to seduction than to admit that a woman might simply be better at the game. Take Theodora, wife of Byzantine Emperor Justinian. Before her rise, she was an actress, which in her time was nearly synonymous with courtesan. But she was also a brilliant political advisor, instrumental in quelling the Nika riots and shaping imperial law. Still, even centuries later, stories about her linger more on her past lovers than on the policies she helped craft. Roxelana, the consort-turned-wife of Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, tells another version of this story. A former slave, she rose through the harem, eventually becoming the Sultan's legal wife, a rare and controversial move. She bore him multiple children, wrote letters filled with devotion and political shrewdness, and wielded real influence in the empire. Yet many accused her of sorcery, manipulation, and bewitchment. Not because she poisoned her enemies, though some rumours say she did, but because she held power where others thought she shouldn't. It wasn't her body that threatened them. It was her mind in tandem with her smile. Even in less documented corners of history, women used intimacy as leverage in quiet, precise ways. African queens like Nzinga of Ndongo negotiated with colonizers over war and land, sometimes offering companionship, sometimes playing hard to get, always controlling the terms. In India, courtesans known as tawaifs were not simply entertainers, they were poets, musicians, and often advisors to kings. They knew which way the wind was blowing in every court and how to adjust their perfume accordingly. Pleasure was not a distraction, it was diplomacy. And yet history has rarely been kind to these women. Their intelligence is downplayed, their agency twisted into seduction, their decisions reframed as accidents of beauty. The deeper truth is simpler in societies that locked women out of conventional power. Some found alternate doors. They learned to speak in glances, to trade safety for strategy, to smile while memorizing maps. Not every affair was political. Not every gesture was planned. But when history tried to paint them as villains or vixens, these women leaned back and let the rumours swirl while quietly rewriting the laws. Now as your eyes grow heavy and the air stills, imagine a chamber lit with soft lanterns, where a queen sits at her writing desk, her robe slipping from one shoulder, her expression unreadable. Behind her a lover sleeps. Ahead of her a letter waits, part love, part ultimatum, part empire. She dips her brush in ink and smiles faintly. She knows what she's doing. For in the end, pleasure wasn't her downfall. It was her throne. Now open the drawer. History keeps half closed, the one filled with carved curiosities, smooth stones worn by hands, and manuals that promise pleasure long before glossy magazines ever did. Despite what some might imagine, the ancient world was not sexually clueless or timid. Across civilizations, people crafted objects, tools, charms, devices that added something extra to the experience of intimacy. Call them toys, tools, or sacred instruments. These were the artifacts of a desire both private and practical. They weren't hidden in shame. They were used, honoured, passed down, and sometimes buried with a knowing smile. Let's begin in the Roman Empire, where archaeologists have uncovered everything from bronze phallic amulets to delicately carved ivory dildos. These items weren't always tucked away, either phallic symbols were common decorations in Roman homes, marketplaces, and even military camps. To the Romans, the erect penis was a symbol of protection, virility, and good luck. The god Priapus, often depicted with an enormous and perpetually erect member, was a household deity meant to guard gardens and fertility. One mosaic shows him weighing his own genitals against a basket of fruit, and no, that wasn't a metaphor for modesty, but not all Roman devices were symbolic. Some were functional. A wooden phallic object found in Vindolanda, a Roman fort in Britain, was once thought to be a pestle, until researchers reconsidered its size, shape, and smooth finish. Suddenly it made more sense as something far more personal. Was it a sex toy? Historians still argue whether its use was intimate or medicinal, but its design speaks for itself. Practicality, after all, rarely comes with blushing. Ancient China had its own elegant approach. In tombs dating back to the Han Dynasty, jade eggs and phallic-shaped objects have been found among the treasures of elite women. These weren't just pleasure devices, they were also tools for internal health, used in Taoist sexual practices to strengthen pelvic muscles, balance energy, and maintain youthful vitality. The classic of the bedchamber describes exercises involving such tools, encouraging women to master their bodies in both sensation and control. Pleasure, yes, but also wellness. The line between the two was always thinner than people like to admit. In India, while the Kama Sutra didn't feature diagrams of devices, other texts in the same family of literature known as Kama Shastra did. These included instructions for creating ointments, perfumes, and aphrodisiacs, as well as recipes for herbal lubricants and arousal-enhancing drinks. One such recipe involved boiling milk with saffron cloves and powdered rose petals. Another advised men to carve a small pleasure wand from ivory, rub it with warm ghee, and wrap it in fine silk before use. There were no batteries, no packaging, just intention, patience, and craft. In medieval Japan, carved wooden phalluses known as haragata were sometimes used by women during long periods of abstinence, like when husbands were away at war. These tools were sometimes given as wedding gifts, along with shunga prints, those explicit but artful woodblock illustrations depicting a range of sensual scenarios. Some shunga even featured imaginative inventions, spring-loaded devices, prosthetics for elderly lovers, or even double-ended instruments. Were they real, or just fantasy? No one's certain, but the images themselves reflect a culture that didn't turn away from pleasure, it rendered it in ink and pressed it into the page. Even in Africa, among tribes with little written record, archaeologists have uncovered figurines and sculpted objects with unmistakable intent. Fertility dolls weren't always just symbols, they were sometimes tactile teaching tools. Young women preparing for marriage were taught with models how to give, how to receive, how to recognise. Among the Yoruba herbalists brewed tonics that enhanced sensitivity, while among the Himba natural oils were applied to the body in ways that left a little doubt about their purpose. Intimacy again was not abstract, it was learned, prepared for enhanced. And let us not forget the ancient Greeks. In Athens, women often used Elizabos dildos carved from leather, wood or stone. Some were soaked in oil and stored in urns. Playful references to them appear in comedic plays and household jokes. One satirical poem laments a woman left alone too long, saying she took solace in polished fig wood and slept well despite her husband's campaign. Were these items hidden? Perhaps. But they were known, discussed, and likely shared among friends with laughter and a bit of wine. Early instructional materials, our ancient how-tos, came in many forms. Egyptian papyri, Greek medical texts, Indian treatises and Chinese scrolls offered guidance on everything from arousal techniques to best times of day for conception. One Chinese text advised morning lovemaking for clarity of mind, while one Indian source recommended evenings when the body is calm and the spirit low to the ground. Not every text was explicit. Many used metaphors, lotus flowers, rivers, birds. But the message was there, pleasure could be taught, should be taught. Of course, not all tools were used for joy. Some were medicinal, corrective, or even coercive. In medieval Europe, bizarre instruments were developed by physicians and clerics alike to cure unseemly urges. The chastity belt, while likely more myth than widespread practice, captures this grim approach. Some records speak of herbal suppressants, tonics, designed to cool the humours of overly lustful women. Historians still argue whether these were real treatments or male fantasies of control, but either way they remind us that not all interest in sex was about enhancement. Sometimes it was about fear. Still, for every object built to suppress, there were others carved in joy. Whether hidden in burial chambers or scratched onto pottery, the legacy of early toys and tools tells us something simple and enduring. People have always wanted to understand their own pleasure. They experimented. They whispered advice. They passed it down like heirlooms. Now, as you settle deeper into your covers and the room around you fades into soft shadow, imagine a quiet corner of a home centuries ago, a box under a bed, a satchel tucked behind a woven screen, a clay figure passed discreetly from hand to hand. No advertisements, no manuals with shiny covers, just curiosity, ingenuity, and the timeless truth that desire when honoured gently becomes both memory and craft. Now lower your ear not to a lecture hall or scripture scroll, but to a humble home. Clay-walled room sealed by woven reed mats where the fire's glow softens the edges of the night. What did sex actually feel like in the ancient world? Not symbolically, not ritually, just. Really. When the doors closed, when the candles sputtered low and two people leaned toward each other unsure whether the moment would end in laughter, awkwardness, or a deep, wordless knowing. This was intimacy far from the marble statues and silk canopies. No gods, no scribes, just skin and breath and the scratch of clay under the bed frame. Archaeology gives us bones, jewellery and ruins, but it rarely gives us noise. Yet behind every sealed door there were sounds, the creak of reed beds, the sigh of linen robes falling to the floor, the nervous cough of a groom barely old enough to grow a beard. Sex was physical, sure, but it was also emotional, social and unpredictable. People were nervous, or eager, or maybe just bored. They didn't follow a script carved in stone. They had to figure things out by feel, by smell, by proximity, and yes, by trial and error. Some rooms had beds, others didn't. In many cultures, the first night was spent on mats laid over packed earth, surrounded by sleeping animals, crying children, or in-laws whispering behind thin walls. Privacy, as we think of it today, didn't always exist. A couple might wait until the house was quiet, or not wait at all. In some African and Pacific Islander communities, young lovers met in designated love huts, modest shelters outside the main home specifically built to allow exploration. In others, there was no such formality, only a quiet glance exchanged after dinner, a flick of a wrist under the blanket, and a moment stolen before dawn. And what about touch? How did ancient lovers learn where, how, or when? The answer is often they didn't. Or at least not with much guidance. Most were married young, expected to figure out sex on their own, or through quiet mentorship. An older cousin, a sibling, a helpful aunt who offered cryptic advice and a jar of oil. Manuals were rare, and if they existed, they were usually reserved for elites. For everyone else, the education was experiential, which means the first attempts were often clumsy, positions misjudged, timing off. But maybe nestled in laughter or whispered apologies, a kind of sweetness bloomed. Sensory details mattered. The smoke of the fire clung to hair. Animal skins were itchy. Cold floors sent shivers up backs. Lubrication, when used, came from kitchen staples, clarified butter oils pressed from seeds, or olives, mashed herbs mixed into soft pastes. Scent was both a tool and a warning. A lover's natural musk might be intoxicating or overwhelming. A mouthful of crushed garlic a day without washing, these weren't neutral factors. Desire had to make room for discomfort, and still it found a way. For many, especially women, sex was expected but rarely explained. In marriage, it was a duty, an act of loyalty, obedience, or survival. Pleasure was a possible bonus, but not the point. One might be told to be still, or do as he says, or simply endure until morning. And yet we find traces in letters, in poetry, in the graffiti of ancient cities of women, describing desire, memory, and even preference. A wife in Pompeii scrawled, "I love the one who kissed me too quickly." Another wrote, "He held me like a soldier holds his blade." These were not declarations of duty, they were personal echoes. Men, for their part, also felt pressure. To perform, to prove, to dominate. Erectile failure wasn't a punchline, it was humiliation. Potions were brewed, talismans, worn prayers whispered. Some visited brothels first to practice. Others waited until marriage and prayed it would come naturally. For those whose partners were strangers, arranged by family, chosen by dowry, delivered with expectations, the act could feel more like a transaction than a connection. But over time, with luck, maybe it softened. Maybe shared chores turned into touches. Maybe love arrived after obligation had cooled. Sounds again speak louder than text. The quick intake of breath, the rhythmic thud of a headboard, The sudden laugh when knees bump or someone falls off the edge of a straw mat. The cry of a baby in the next room. The barking of a dog outside. These were not fantasy settings. They were lived real layered moments. Not all were joyful. Some were painful. Some were endured and not shared. But many were tender in their clumsy, flickering way. Not all intimacy was penetrative. In some cultures, foreplay was the main act. Caresses, massages, mutual pleasure without risk of pregnancy. In Japan, lovers were known to exchange locks of hair. In India, couples marked each other with ash or turmeric. In the Arctic, skin-on-skin warmth was survival as well as desire. Fingers, mouths, eyes, these were the first languages of connection. And unlike the scrolls and scriptures, they were universally understood. So much of ancient sex wasn't about instruction. It was about instinct. A woman leaning her head just so. A man knowing not to rush. A moment held between inhale and exhale when the fire crackles, and two people find the same rhythm. No perfect script, no cinematic soundtrack. Just the soft, honest sounds behind clay doors where the oldest language touch breath pause was spoken over and over, long before anyone wrote it down. Now as your breath slows and your own walls fall quiet, picture a darkened room lit only by the embers of a fading fire. Two figures, neither young nor old, lie close together, their hands loosely entwined, their conversation finished hours ago. There's nothing urgent in their touch, just recognition, just warmth. And in that warmth, the same hush that's lived behind every door in every age waiting to be remembered. And now the candle burns low. We've wandered through temples, tombs, thatched huts, and palace halls, heard the whispers behind veils, the creak of straw mats, the sighs beneath jade ceilings. The question that remains curled like a cat in the dark is simple. Has anything really changed? We like to think of ourselves as modern, progressive, far removed from the fumbling, law-bound, ritual-laced sexuality of our ancestors. But desire, as it turns out, is remarkably durable. The scenery shifts, the rules change, the awkwardness eternal. We still chase the same questions. What is allowed? What is sacred? What is pleasurable and what is shameful? We still argue over what counts as love, who gets to express it, and where the lines should be drawn. Our ancestors etched their anxieties into stone tablets and prayer scrolls. We post ours online. They whispered fears into confessionals. We tap them into search bars after midnight. Different tools. Same hunger. In some ways, we've broken barriers they couldn't have dreamed of. Consent is spoken of loudly, urgently, necessarily. More people have language for their identities. More freedom to choose who, how, and when. Sex education exists at least in theory. Women no longer vanish into the margins the moment desire enters the conversation, at least not everywhere. Men aren't always shackled to the myth of dominance. And people across more cultures than ever are learning that touch can be gentle without losing meaning. And yet the old ghosts linger. Purity myths still haunt young women in many parts of the world. Queerness, though celebrated in one country, is criminalised in another. Virginity is still traded like currency in some cultures. Men still wrestle silently with expectations of performance control and pride. The double standard hasn't fully died, it's just changed costumes. And shame. Shame is a shapeshifter. It always finds a new disguise. The technology may be modern, but the emotions are ancient. A teenager sending a bold text to someone they like is not so far from the Roman girl writing a secret love letter on a wax tablet. A married couple, years into routine finding each other again in the quiet of a late-night conversation, is not so different from a Viking pair curled beneath a fur blanket. A lover searching for the right words to ask, "Do you want me?" echoes every generation that came before. We're still learning to ask that question kindly. Even the objects remain familiar. Wooden phalluses replaced by silicone, herbal oils replaced by brightly labelled bottles on nightstands. Instructions once read in sacred texts now come via tutorials guides and whispered group chats. We think we're clever, but in truth we've always been creative. The difference is today we can buy what our ancestors had to carve, distill or imagine. But the desire to connect deeply, clumsily, fully has never needed translation. Where we've changed most is in the conversation. We can talk, or at least try, about pleasure dysfunction boundaries healing, about trauma play recovery. We have books, podcasts, counsellors, safe spaces, however fragile, where people can speak their truths without losing their names. That might be our greatest evolution, the right to speak of what was once only groaned behind walls and buried in silence. Still, we're not immune to performance. Social media has replaced the marble statue with a filtered image, the love poem with a captioned thirst trap. We curate our desire, package it, sell it, and sometimes we forget to feel it. Or we fear it's not enough. Our ancestors had the church or the temple to tell them what sex should be. We have algorithms, but we also have choice, messy, imperfect, sometimes terrifying choice. To reclaim pleasure not as a duty or a debt or a forbidden fruit, but as a language, we're all still learning to speak, to explore bodies without ownership, to fumble and laugh and try again. We have the freedom to heal from old stories and write new ones, to say no without guilt, to say yes with joy. And perhaps most importantly, we're beginning to understand that sex at its best isn't about conquest, or performance, or ritual. It's about presence. Two people sometimes, three sometimes one, meeting themselves in a moment of soft honesty, with breath, with patience, with kindness. So what's changed? Tools, terms, laws, some freedoms. What hasn't? The blush before a first kiss, the fear of rejection, the awkward tangle of limbs in a too small bed, the quiet satisfaction of a hand held after. These things are older than language, deeper than law. They are the truths we carry, not in textbooks, but in bone. And now, let the breath in your chest deepen. Let your jaw loosen. Let the muscles behind your eyes soften into stillness. You've travelled far tonight through temples and firesides, poems and courtrooms, scrolls and silences. You've listened in on the oldest of conversations, the one spoken without words, written not in ink but in touch. Sex stripped of spectacle is just this, a moment where two people stop pretending they're alone. Let the noise of history settle now. Let the debates, the shame, the rules fade. Imagine instead the hum of a warm room, a flicker of lamplight across familiar skin, the rhythm of breathing slowed in harmony. There is no audience, no one to impress, no ideal to chase. Just you, and perhaps someone beside you, or the memory of someone once held. Maybe the warmth of your own skin beneath the sheet. We are all descendants of bodies that reach for closeness, that whispered, trembled, ached, and laughed, under the same moon that glows now beyond your window. Our ancestors didn't leave us just bloodlines. They left us this map of longing, and we're still learning how to read it. So rest now, sink into quiet. The doors are closed, the fire is low, and the night is yours again.